The 2022 IMMAF Pan American Championships are happening this week from June 22nd to the 24th in Monterrey, Mexico. The Americans will be there, of course. Our guest is Jon Frank, the president of the United States Fight League. How you doing, Jon?
I'm doing good, thank you.
Right on. So for context, please tell us, what's the current state of amateur MMA in the United States of America?
So amateur MMA in the United States is pretty much like 50 different scenarios for 50 different states, because each state, as people know in the US, is governed by an athletic commission. There's no sports ministry. So each state has different rules and regulations and different ways to regulate the sport. So some areas, amateur MMA is very strong, like in California. And then in other areas, professional MMA is much stronger than amateur MMA. And the level of skill, it's hard to get a good gauge on state by state as far as skill, because there's very little cross-state competition. So it's a work in progress.
It sounds like a very sort of complex scenario, right? As you're mentioning, there's all these different independent states, and it sounds like it's complex, but I'm sure you guys are working on solutions and you're making it happen, because obviously you're sending a team to the Pan American Championships. Can you tell us who will be representing Team USA?
Right. So we have 10 athletes scheduled. We have a couple that are having difficulties. So I'm hoping we get all 10 there at this late stage. But at the lower weight classes, we actually have at 115 and 125 alumni from our youth program that we've developed. We have a really strong youth program in the US. And we have Adrian Ledesma at 115. He was a national champ for us. And then we have Rashad Satterwhite at 125, who was also not only a national champ, but he was a youth world champ for us. Both of them came through our youth program. At 135, we have a fighter from Texas. Well, both the Rashad and Adrian are from California. And then we have Carlos from Texas at 135. 145, we were able to get two fighters in. A fighter from Florida, David Camacho, who's fought with IMMAF before at the World Championships. He's the only one that has adult MMA experience within IMMAF. And then we have a really strong fighter from California. At 155, we have a strong fighter from Texas, Lester Batras. I wish I had my roster in front of me. At 170, we have another strong California fighter. 185 is a fighter from Oklahoma, Gabe Rednose, who's Native American, representing that community. And then at 205, we're hoping he makes it. We have a fighter from Pennsylvania, David Kraus. So it's a fairly good mix, but the primarily states that are represented is California, Texas, and Florida, which are three big states for amateur MMA.
Can you tell us a bit more about the youth program? You mentioned you guys have a very good youth program. I believe I saw some articles on that on IMMAF's website. Tell us a bit more about the youth program.
Yeah, so we've been doing youth pancration or youth MMA for about 20 years in the US, and it started in California. So in California has very deep roots, which is maybe one of the reasons why there's a very deep amateur program in California. But we do have nationwide competitions, and more than half of the states are represented. So we have about 35 states represented. But it's similar rules as IMMAF. We feed into the IMMAF program. We've taken first and third in the World Championships in the last two. And it's a pretty robust program. We haven't been able to do 20 years straight. We've had to stop because we had to deal with regulatory issues. But right now we're delegated by the Department of Consumer Affairs for the California State Commission to run the program for the state as if it's amateur MMA. And there's other states where we run it, but it's not something that the state would regulate. So there's a lot of different obstacles. But we're at the point now where we had a really strong younger age group, like 12 and 13s. And then in 2021, our cadet Bs, which is 14 and 15, were really strong. And we're finally at the point where our 16 and 17s are really strong. So it's kind of building that progression. And if, the logical progression follows, we're going to have really strong 18 and 19-year-olds, and hopefully we'll be very competitive in the world, the world standings in the next few years if we keep going this way.
Very interesting. So the youngest group starts at 12. You're saying the youngest is 12?
Yes, we start at 8.
Oh, wow.
They don't feed into the international program until they're 12. Okay. So the youngest that go to the worlds are 12 and 13. And we've got some seasoned 12 and 13-year-olds. We have youth fighters that have had 30, 40, 50 fights before their first amateur fight.
Wow.
They're ready to go. A lot of them, it's not unfortunate. It's actually fortunate, but it's not the logical progression. We do have a lot that skip over amateur and they go pro right away. Which is something I think with more developments with IMMAF, they'll be less likely to do, because sometimes it's really hard to get an amateur fight. And these kids are ready to go. So they maybe have one or they skip it altogether and then they fight for pro, which sometimes works. But again, you want to have that good amateur experience before you have a permanent record.
It's really interesting what you guys are doing there, or what you've been doing for 2 decades, as far as building up that pancration community, leading into mixed martial arts, of course. For those who don't know what pancration is, can you give us a brief overview? What is pancration?
Right. Well, it's obviously there's no headshots, no head strikes. There's a lot of technique limitations, techniques that have historically caused injury or are likely to cause injury are removed. And there's a sliding scale where the older the kids are, the more they can do. And then in the US, we use a point-based scoring system. So it's not the criteria is not who delivers punishment or damage or, pummels the other kid. It's the one who delivers the most amount of technique. So it forces them to go into their toolbox, forces them to be good at wrestling, forces them to be good at ground positioning, forces them to be good at striking, and not just pounding. They have to have, it makes them actually really good counter strikers, believe it or not, the point system. It promotes a little bit of more technical counter strikers than aggressive. And of course, submissions. That's how you win the fight. And we have maybe a 60% plus submission rate with all our youth fighters. So more than half of the bouts always end in submission because they very aggressively go for it. That's what the rules promote. So once they are at the level when they can fight amateur, they have a huge toolbox. Now they can take out of it what they want, or if they're just, power hitters, they can go in for the kill, something they can't do as a kid. So it kind of gives them, that airbag or safety net by having a lot of technical skill and knowledge. It also gets them seasoned because every time you compete, half the battle is getting there, the check-in, the weigh-ins, the nerves, the composure, knowing how to deal with a loss, which is huge. All these lessons should be learned when you're a youth fighter, because when you're an adult professional, it's too late. As an amateur, you're supposed to be learning this also, but a lot of the amateur careers are not long enough to really develop all those attributes.
Right. And I think I saw a tweet you put out a while ago in regards to the injury rate being next to 0, right? As far as the youth program. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, we have every bout we have, there's a pre-fight and a post-fight medical evaluation. So the pre-fight is actually more extensive. The post-fight, every kid who, as they enter the cage or the mat, they go see the doctor. They have a short question and answer. The doctor evaluates them based on the fight. And we get a written report of every injury that the doctor deems an injury, meaning they need to either take time off or they need to follow up with another, their own personal doctor or medical care. That's what an injury is recorded. Not, obviously there's a lower level of injuries,
right.
boo-boo, we call it for the kids, but those are all recorded. And we have basically 40 injuries out of over 3,000 athletic exposures.
Wow.
So I don't know what the percentage of that is. I'm not good in math, but I know it's less than.
Right, for sure. No, it's interesting to notice in terms of safety. There's a lot of safety consideration, of course, for the participants. Now, tell us. I think you mentioned this a bit earlier on. As far as the U.S., how have they performed at previous IMMAF tournaments?
So, like everything, the U.S. always has a pattern. In the beginning, the U.S. is dominant in everything we do. All sports, everything. And when IMMAF first started, I wasn't part of it. We just came on recently. I know the U.S. were very dominant because it was new and there was a lot of excitement and there was a lot of unity. Let USA, let's do this.
All right.
And as years go by, because there are so many factions of amateur MMA in the U.S., there's so many different sanctioning groups. Sometimes the state is a sanctioning group. There are promoters that have local tournaments, but they give world championship belts. The unity just wasn't there. And it's really hard to build that type of unity in that type of environment. So as the years have gone by, the USA performance has gone down, while other countries, the sport is adopted by their sports ministries, like their Olympic Committee. Right. They have their youth program is infantile next to ours, but it's already bigger than ours in countries that just started. And their progression is just off the chart, how they're building MMA fighters, where in the US, aside from the different factions, we still have the scheme, like our recipe to build a MMA fighter. You take an elite athlete from another sport at the twilight of their career, and then you bring them to MMA.
Right.
That can only work so far when other countries are taking those elite athletes and building them up as MMA fighters. That's a detriment for us, but we do have the sport. It's such a huge country and we have such great coaches. I mean, the US has the best coaches in the world because, despite what's going on, everybody still wants to live here. Hopefully that stays. So we do have great coaches. It's just we don't have that type of unity yet.
Yeah, very interesting, which leads into this next question that I have for you. How would you communicate the value of having a well-established amateur mixed martial arts community in the US? Because as you know, like some folks would say, why amateur MMA when you can just become a professional and fight, at the quote unquote highest level of the on the professional side. So how do you communicate the value of having amateur mixed martial arts in the US?
Right. So we had, I'm sure everybody's aware that we have a fighter named Aaron Pico, fights in Bellator. He started the youth program with us. He was the same fighter as a youth, as an adult. We used to have to check his gloves for his left hook because he hit so hard, 12-year-old kid. But he basically completely skipped amateur MMA in the developmental. He went right to high-level MMA. And, he had a rough start. He's with that. So, that's an extreme case. And he's probably, I still believe, destined to be the pound-for-pound greatest fighter in MMA history. But I believe if he would have gone through an amateur development right now, as we speak today, at his current age, he would be the best fighter pound for pound in MMA history if he went through that. The problem is in some states, especially in the state of California, professional MMA is very, very difficult. There's a lot less promotions compared to amateur. So if you're not an elite, high-level professional fighter, you are not going to make a lot of money. You're going to make money based off your ticket sales, and a high percentage of your fights are going to get canceled because there's such a small pool of higher level people. Whereas in California, in the amateur program, you can fight. There's multiple events going on all over the state every single week. So you can really get a lot of experience. And what I think needs to be done, because unlike amateur boxing, amateur MMA can be a lot more rough on your body. You know, boxing is just two-dimensional. You got big gloves, headgear, 3-round fights, but amateur MMA is pretty rough. So the ideal situation is to get maximum amount of experience while your odometer is still relatively low. So if you can fight multiple fights in 6 months or a year, get yourself ready, go to a big international tournament against the world's best, fight multiple fights in one event, you know, like the Pan Am's coming up or the Worlds. And if you are successful in that, then you have a really educated decision to turn pro and not recreational as an amateur. Because right now it's still, you know, in boxing, if you have like one loss on your record, that's career changing. Luckily for MMA, it's not like that right now, but eventually it's going to be like that because the skill levels are going up and up and up and up and up. And then if you look at, you know, what I said before, if you look at the UFC, how many American UFC champs do we have right now? It used to be all American and Brazilian, right?
Right.
I was all American. Now we can't even pronounce the names of most of the UFC champions because they're going through this progression of youth, robust amateur program. They're still learning their mistakes as an amateur, where they do have some degree of a safety net. They're not getting thrown to the wolves once you're a pro, and it's helping a lot. I mean, you can see the rest of the world, not the whole world, but a lot of other countries, what they're doing, they found the recipe, which we don't have in the US.
Very interesting. I think I could probably stick on this topic for quite some time, but I'm curious to know, how does California differ from, say, the community in Texas and Florida as far as that amateur scene? Because you mentioned Florida, Texas, and California as having a really, I guess, robust amateur community. How do they differ?
Yeah, I mean, well, instead of trying to focus on the entire country, we really are focusing on the 3, what we believe is a hotbed areas. We have regional coordinators that are tied to multiple events that want to have a successful US program. So we have 3 guys, but it's usually a big force multiplier in reaching out to fighters, because those 3 guys have, you know, are tied to well over 100 events a year, well over. But Florida, so for Florida, and all 3 are different, totally different. So I'll start with Florida. Florida has maybe 20 to 30 different amateur sanctioning groups. It's like the Wild West. There's so many different groups there. Some of them work together, some of them work against each other. But there's also, it's very easy to work with the state to have a professional fights there. So there's a lot of pro-am. So there are a lot of amateur competitions there, but the time spent as an amateur is very short in Florida because there's so many professional opportunities. And so the really high level guys in Florida don't stay amateur for that long. Now, if you go to Texas, the state is the one-stop shop. They run everything. And it's also like that as well, where, you know, that since they run everything, when you have an amateur fight, it's usually a pro-am. So just like Florida, they don't really stay amateur for that long, they'll turn pro a little bit faster. But the state runs it all. Now, California, there's one organization that runs all the amateur, CAMO. And I think if you measured them, they're probably the biggest athletic commission in the country because the amount of events they do. And because they do so many events, there's so many opportunities for them to fight. And there's so many promoters that are running CAMO events, there are less professional events. So I believe that makes the level of the amateur program in California a little bit higher than other places, because other places they'll turn professional quicker. There's no way to really measure this because there's very little cross-country competition. So I don't know if my theory is correct, but just from what I see, as a fan, that's what I believe is going on.
Yeah, now it's interesting. Do you know if there's any, so there's no cross-state competition, but is CAMO, do they share their best practices with other states in order to kind of augment their ability to, to standardize these sports? Is there any of that sort of engagement happening?
Yeah, I really think for all three of those states, they do put together their best practices as far as regulatory and safety.
Right.
And I know CAMO is probably a little bit stricter because they can be, because unlike Florida, if I don't like the sanctioning group, I got 30 others to pick from, right? So you basically are there to please the customer, the fighter and the promoter.
Right.
Where in California, they don't really need to please the customer. It's like, this is the way it's going to be done, and this is the way we're doing it. And then Texas, it may be because the commission does pro-am, they're going to maybe put a little more emphasis on pro, right? Because, that's, so they all do their best practices, but I think the structure in California, I'm in California, it's maybe not the best for promoters, in a business sense. Maybe it's even rougher for the fighters, but as far as the big picture, for really strict regulations and really building strong amateur fighters, because that's all they focus on. It's like, you guys know, In-N-Out Burger. I don't know if when people come to California, they want In-N-Out. So that's all they make, just a hamburger. There's not, chicken or whatever. So that's all they do. Right. They just focus on amateur. There's nothing else. But again, all three states are what I consider the powerhouse in the U.S. for amateur and professional MMA.
This is very interesting. If you don't mind, I want to ask another follow-up on this topic. Are there any regional, outside of just those three major, powerhouses? What about the Northeast and the Midwest? Do you guys have affiliates there in New York or even in Minnesota? Or?
Yeah, basically what we did is instead of trying to conquer the entire world, we conquered not conquer, but we're focusing on three really strong regions and right. three very strong individuals that have reached beyond, their own states. So, but what we're learning, and we're new to this, is having a great fighter is great, obviously, but there's a lot more to it. Not really the business sense of it, but I don't know how to term this, but you may have the greatest fighter in the world, but if you can't get him to the cage, it doesn't really help. Right. So we really need people that are able to get their medicals done, get their paperwork in, get the registration done properly. It's difficult. Some of these guys are really good fighters, but those tasks are not always easy for fighters to handle. And that can be a detriment to our pool of athletes. So what we want is to have these regional coordinators not only get us really good fighters, but vet these fighters, make sure they're going to make it to the cage, get with the program, because it's not just showing up to fight, as anybody knows. You know, it's making weight, it's getting your paperwork done, your medicals done, getting there, you know, in timely manner. Stuff like that is very important. You know, we're talking professionalism. Even at the amateur, you got to be a professional as far as your obligations.
Absolutely. It's really interesting that you guys are taking a practical approach by having this sort of regional representation with the main key powerhouses, as you mentioned, California, Texas, and Florida. I think you've already answered this, but I'm still going to ask you this question, if you don't mind. As far as as far as amateur MMA sports development in the USA, what are the opportunities for growth and participation? Also, what are some of the challenges to that growth?
Well, I mean, the challenges are kind of what I spoke about before. You have, there is not a national movement. Like when MMA becomes an Olympic sport, I think most of our problems would be solved, because you wouldn't have as much infighting, different promotions trying to undercut each other. You wouldn't have false belts and titles. You know, there's so many. It's like a you know, if you're old enough to remember the Yellow Pages and you look in martial arts, you look at the Taekwondo schools, everybody's an Olympic coach.
Right.
You know, it's kind of like that. There's so many world national champions, there's so many titles. There's nothing, you know, the respect for that title has gone way down. And then you have the states, you know, the governmental control over amateur MMA is a problem in a lot of sense, because they see it as their own little kingdom, their own little state, which prohibits some, you know, cross-country competition. And also they don't really see the vision of an international team.
Wow.
Because it's outside of their realm. And each state has a different business model as well. Like some states, the reason why CAMO works in California is because the State Athletic Commission makes their money. They don't make their money off of taxpayer. They make their money off of competitions, but they also have to pay their staffing, their inspectors. So small professional shows are not in their business model. Big ones, they make a lot of money. So an organization like CAMO can come in and take all those smaller professional shows and give a promoter a place to go, whereas maybe the state doesn't want to expend a lot of money because they're going to spend more than they get back. But now there's other states where they charge a lot of fees for the amateur, and they make money off of the amateur, even the smaller shows. So again, you know, they're looking at the end of the day, they have to balance their budget. They have to pay for their staff and employees. They don't want to give up amateur MMA because they make money off of it, and that money guarantees their job. You know, even though it's a governmental job. So each state is different, and somewhere in between. Those are the two extremes. Some of them make bank off of amateur MMA, and some of them lose money. So it's obviously neither of those scenarios good for developing. Why am I going to work with something that I lose money on, or why am I going to give up something to an international group or a national group where we're going to lose money?
Wow, yeah, it certainly sounds complicated and complex. But what are your thoughts on IMMAF and the work they've been doing to develop, standardize, and promote the sport of amateur mixed martial arts worldwide? What are your thoughts on IMMAF?
It's a massive undertaking. I mean, it's massive, but it's working in a lot of different areas, a lot of different countries. Because they see it as an Olympic sport, even if it's not in the Olympics yet. That's the way they're managing it. IMMAF is managing amateur MMA as if it was an Olympic sport. And I know people talk bad about the Olympics and this and that, but that's how you want to develop an amateur sport, right? The same way the Olympics develop amateur sports. You have to make it safe, right? But you have to make it competitive. You have to make it safe enough where people can compete multiple times. I think for their worlds and IMMAF, they fight 4 or 5 times in a row every day. So whatever they're doing is enabling that. If it was exactly the same as professional, which to me it looks the same if you watch it as professional MMA, but whatever they're doing, they're enabling people to be able to fight. For the majority, are able to fight multiple days, and they do have all the doctors with that, and that's a lot of experience. And then with the youth development program, what amateur sport neglects its youth? There's none,
right?
Except for MMA. What professional sport neglects its amateur development program? None, except for MMA. MMA is the same sport as everything else. So that's exactly what IMMAF is doing. It's filling the shoes, and there's a lot of probably behind the scenes stuff because maybe a lot of combat sports in the Olympics is threatened by it, rightfully so. But they're doing a lot of things right. They it's still a work in progress. There's communication issues because they're dealing with so many different places. They're trying to secure venues. It'd be nicer if we can get notified a lot sooner of when the international competitions are, because that's really our starting point. Once we learn that, then we can set up something for our nationals and create our team. Things like that. We run into problems in the US with some of the medical stuff because doctors aren't as easy to get to in the US as other countries, different things like that. But it's something needed. And I guarantee if MMA got in the Olympics, it'd be the #1 viewed sport in the Olympics. And if it's anything like what they're doing now, if you call it watered down, you can call it watered down, but you don't really see much difference as far as the skill level and excitement as professional MMA. In some reason, in most regards, is even more exciting because of the shorter rounds and the more aggressiveness, the nature of fighters, and that international flair to it, where you have true country versus country. That's exciting.
Big time. And it's also interesting to see, these young athletes progress over time from 12 to 14, you know what I mean? Moving up in age within the sport of mixed martial arts, not starting off, say in one particular martial art. And I'm not knocking that, but I'm just saying, if you look at the quality of fighter that will come out of that system, as you guys know, because you've been doing this for 20 years on the Pan Creation side, you see the development, right? And the potential in that athlete. So it'll be, I think, as a fan of a lot of these Olympic combat sports and non-Olympic combat sports, I think this is, in my opinion, I think it could be a real major game changer for the sport of mixed martial arts on the amateur side, but also on the professional side, because now you're going to see essentially, the future of the sport, which is young athletes who've been doing it, for X amount of time and really honing their skills and so on. Last question for you, Jon. How do you think Team USA will do at the Pan American Championships?
Like I said, when you a lot of this is in question, even within our own country, if you compete guys from one state to another, because it's a lot of unknown. I really don't know. I mean, I think the United States has the best coaches in the world. We actually, we have great athletes. I think we're going to do really good. But, until we've never had a Pan Am Games, right. We don't know who to get into. We've had a lot of, with the kids program, a lot of small fish or big fish in a little bowl come to the national championships. And that's, an eye opener, because we really get the best kids in the United States at our national championships. So we think we're really good within our own community and with our own little regions, because that's where we are. We're just a regionalized sport. some of the countries are, you know, realistically pretty new in MMA, but there are also countries like Mexico that really have embraced this developmental program where they have state championships. The state championships feed into their national championships. They have a huge, robust youth program. You know, I think Mexico is going to be really tough. I think Colombia has kind of embraced that program as well. Colombia is going to be tough. You know, we're going to be tough too, because, you know, I consider MMA our sport. This is America's sport, you know, just like baseball, basketball, all that stuff. But, you know, look what happens in the Little League World Series, right, with baseball.
What happens, Jon? What happens if, say, all of the athletes representing Team USA make the podium? What will that mean for amateur mixed martial arts development in the USA if each of your athletes essentially make the podium?
Well, that would give us, you know, something called momentum, because right now we are starting from nothing as far as for us. We just started working with adult amateurs just a few months ago, and you know we've stumbled a lot because of we were struggling to find a structure, and we found somebody who's there now, Jim Nightingale, our delegation leader, who after some trial and error, we found an individual that's doing this just for the sole reason to build a national program. I think this will help us build momentum towards the World Championships, especially if we have these three regions and these three regional coordinators that continue to stay involved. They're going to see success. They're going to see something beyond not only their own hometown promoter,
right,
their own state, their own region, their own country. Now we're looking international and looking at the World Championships. That's a, you know, for lack of a better term, that's a meat grinder. If we can get a world champ, I might have lost you a bit low battery. That's going to create even more momentum. The idea is to find the right people, not fighters first, to find the right people that can manage these programs, administrators, organizers, delegation leaders. If we can do that, and do it for the right purposes, just to build a strong national program, to see the US flag on the podium all the time. And that's the reason why they're doing it. For that reason solely, then the athletes are going to naturally flock towards this program. And we have great athletes. We just have to build a roadmap that not only they can follow, but they have to want to follow it. Right. And, you know, it all starts with right now we're taking our first baby step.
Right. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the next coming days. Obviously, the championships are this. It's coming in a few days, and I'm really curious to see how the U.S. does, and also how American fans react to this, because as you mentioned, it'll certainly gain a lot of momentum for the program. And the great work that you guys are doing in terms of developing the sport within your country. Jon, I want to wish you and the team all the best. Thank you very much for your time. And I hope to do this again, maybe after the championships. Maybe we can talk about some of the matches and so on.
Yeah, look forward to it. Look forward to having a positive conversation after Pan Am's.
Right on. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, sir.
All right, you too.